Thanks everybody for joining us tonight, myself and Andre, for these two inaugural lectures. I first heard of my promotion in September 2019. That was obviously back then. And in June 2020, the original lecture was planned, but so I got another couple of years to prepare and get a bit more grey. And of course, then be joined by Andre, which is great. Tribulations, Trials, and People with MS is the title of my lecture. I will, as you may know, the QMEL notes for these type of lectures state, remember that this is all about you. So I'll take you on a little journey, of course, of what I've done and do and planning to do, but also give you a little bit of backstory of how I came here, which is perhaps not completely unheard of, but still perhaps reasonably unlikely. And in my title, I trust you've noticed the stance I take in this incredibly important debate about the Oxford comma. So we're here. So I've decided to do kind of a little graph with event significance, or a little excitometer, as it were. And I throw myself straight at the deep end to get the cringy stuff out of the way, straight from the beginning. And by showing you this. So, and if you have any issue identifying who is who, this is my brother, Ralph. And the little globe next is me. So I put this up quite high in significance initially, but then we're all replaceable, after all, in the context of things, so I put it rather there. Following various requests, I've also included an experience that is, pretty common for my generation, and that is the Lederhose. Certainly in Germany it was, and so you can already gauge my age a little bit from that. This is also where I grew up. So this is the workshop that my dad owned, and it's now in the hands of my brother, who is here on the left, and with his son. So you see 3 generations of Schmierers in one photo. Unfortunately, they can't be here tonight, but I trust they'll be watching from home, so hello, everybody. I didn't join that fold, which was obviously the original master plan of my dad. I didn't think of immunotechnology at the time, so maybe that would have worked. But we did get a collaboration underway at some point when I examined brain hemispheres and needed a Perspex cutting panel. And this was indeed then done by his firm. So these are the pieces of art that Daniele Carasiti produced ultimately from these sections, which we used for a stereology experiment to establish neuronal numbers in whole hemispheres and the association with myelination in the cortex. And here you can see that there's sort of that a little piece of sleaze, right? No, not really. It was all competitive, and they ultimately got the contract. This is my school. Gymnasium. This is what it looked like back in the day when I attended, and I don't actually remember that many teachers. I think it was all relatively average. But my biology teacher, Carl Paul, and English, Mr. Spars. But to be honest, we were mainly interested in sports, as most kids are. And my sport was basketball. And here's my team. And if you're sort of looking around, so that's me. Okay. Now, I did have a little, I think I'm probably a bit of a risk taker at the time. Okay, so that's me at 15 doing a somersault on skis. And that certainly prepared me for this lot, the ski tour of the neurology department in Chamonix, which includes some non-skiers actually. I think Clarence Liu didn't actually ski. Is he here? No. It's coming. That's right. So Grosgeo you've probably never heard of. It's that little yellow dot in the southwest of Germany, but it has a town hall from the 16th century. And but it may become more interesting when you realize that this is actually only a stone throw away from Darmstadt. And those who are interested in history, as most of you I'm sure are, then you obviously know that Hesse-Darmstadt is the duchy, a grand duchy that was ruled by the Battenbergs, Mountbatten and Mountbatten-Windsor family. And so this is my connection to Her Late Majesty. Okay then. So Darmstadt is obviously also the place of Merck, the oldest pharmaceutical company in the world, which I'm still collaborating. And it's a good opportunity to thank them, but all the supporters and sponsors that have helped me do the work I'm doing over the years, which are all listed here. I think I have them all. Maybe otherwise I can correct the slide. But certainly Merck, but certainly the MS Society, the MRC and the NIHR have been instrumental for the work I do, for the trials I run, for the studies to go ahead. So thank you. And thank you to all the collaborators. They are past, but mainly really current. And if your name is not on there, so don't worry. You may well be on a picture later on. But this is kind of I'd say, a reasonably complete list. So what is MS is the is the question for those who are not familiar. But I just take a little step back here. What about Tribulations? And for that, I'd just like you to kind of immerse yourself in 1980s Berlin. So this is Brezhnev and Honecker doing a proper kiss, and on the wall. So this is a time when the wall was still up, and the East-West conflict very much alive. Some of you may have watched Deutschland '83, and got a little flavor of that. And at the same time, there was a real discussion ongoing still in Germany, among Germans of sort of the post-war generation, about the Nazi period and how it came about and how the atrocities were even possible. And so when you move to Berlin from a small town, then you can't really help sort of avoid that topic. Certainly at the time you couldn't. So here's a piece of that story. This is the instruction to increase the number of doctors to assess disabled people for selection for euthanasia or not. And this happened in Tiergartenstrasse 4, number 4. It was called Action T4. And this is just really, I mean, it's a very central place in Berlin. Maybe you've been there. It's near the Philharmonie now. So I was very intrigued when I met these academics at the Institute for History of Medicine at the Free University, who became my first mentors, as it were, and Peter Schmiedebach, in fact, my supervisor of what turned out then to be a PhD. Now, I can't possibly sort of go into the detail of that, but there's a very good and summary and favorable review by Vernon Liedtke, which is freely available online, or for all the German speakers. I have a copy here. So I think what the exchange with these colleagues led to is really a very strong kind of awareness of disability and the consequences when people start selecting people out. And I became friends with Franz Christoph, who was an activist. He had polio as a child, and he was an activist for the rights of disabled. He wrote books, and I actually wrote a little chapter in the left one here on that side. So I'd say it kind of prepared me a little bit for what I'd done subsequently. So what is MS? It's a chronic demyelinating disease of the CNS, affecting about 3 million worldwide. It starts between 20 and 40 and has a preponderance for women. It's clinically characterized by relapses and remissions of neurological loss of function or dysfunction, say pain or otherwise, regularly associated with underlying chronic deterioration. We know that now. Who gets MS? The Atlas of MS is a very good sort of source for that, looking globally, although the data is obviously of very variable quality. We've looked at this, and this is Christo Albo, one. He was a medical student when we did that work. He's now a registrar in endocrinology. And so we looked at the ethnicity and prevalence of MS here in East London, where obviously we have a very heterogeneous population. And it was interesting to see that as a black woman, apologies, you're as likely to have MS as a white male. And that is obviously, when you look at their territorial ancestry, much higher than the prevalence in where people grew up. It looks that more recent data suggests there's actually very little difference altogether. So there's something about diagnostic ascertainment and other factors that we don't fully understand yet. So it's quite common. What does it look like on MRI? We use MRI all the time. And this is a serial scan by my friend and colleague Charles Gutmann over a number of months, 18 months, so monthly MRI scans. And you can see, I'm just going to replay this, how lesions of MS kind of emerge, sort of mature, and then often also vanish, right? So we didn't appreciate that for some time, but it's quite clear that they can also essentially disappear on the scans. MS leads to disability, and we use a scale called the EDSS, or the Expanded Disability Status Scale, between 0 and 10. 0 is no disability, 10 is death. And these are the timelines in untreated MS, in a historic cohort, at which you would develop certain levels of disability. So 8 years on average, 20 years, one stick around the block, and 30 years largely wheelchair dependent. And that already tells you that this scale is not very helpful when you say you are already in a wheelchair. What's your function going to be then subsequently? So it's very much ambulation driven, which is which is why people are moving away from the EDSS to an extent. There's clearly also an associated loss of quality of life. So here you can see the utility goes down, particularly at a stage where people lose upper limb function. Okay, so you can see that massive step change here between EDSS 7 and 8, where upper limb function goes. And here I have a brief clip to illustrate what it feels like from a patient perspective to get the diagnosis.
Leave the glasses on, stare straight ahead.
I didn't really take it in. I was there with my wife, who's a social worker, started crying because she's with her work, she's had to deal with a lot of people who have MS. And I said, well, is there a cure? Is there anything I can take for it? I said, well, I'm sorry, there isn't anything.
Yeah, there isn't anything. And that is fortunately not the case anymore. This is just a very sort of broad sort of approach to establish what disease modification, but also other measures may have done over time. You can see here in the pre-disease modifying treatment era, you reached about 80% of patients at the age 65 would reach the EDSS-6, so that's one stake around the block, and that has gone down in the first generation of treatments, and it's likely to go down further with the high efficacy treatments that we have now. So obviously this is not only down to treatment or the immunotherapies we use, and there's probably other elements, but that is certainly one of the drivers. This is where I went to uni, Free University in Berlin, and after that, and a stint in Jerusalem, where I did part of my final year, I went to the Charité, and this is the former director actually of the Charité, who was a neurologist, Karl Einhäupl, and a number of colleagues. Some of you may have seen their faces or even know them personally, who've all been really inspirational and very good trainers and educators at the time. So I'm really grateful for them. But he was clearly outstanding was Rolf Chandlerlein, who nobody knows, but he was a clinical immunologist, an excellent clinician, and one who very much sort of supported and facilitated my career at that point. This is a picture of Bernd Ulrich Meyer, who I did my first true research with in medicine. He wrote at a very early stage a book about transcranial magnetic stimulation, or generally about magnetic stimulation of the nervous system. And he and others found that when you stimulate the brain, here the cortex, with a strong magnetic pulse, you not only get a twitch on the contralateral hand or lower limb, but you also cause an inhibition, a silent period, on the ipsilateral, on the same side, where you actually do the stimulation. And this called sort of transcallosal inhibition was then further developed, or we developed that further into clinical tools, because that changes in disease. So we've did this work looking at early diagnostics, so people with a very low EDSS, and how much deficits they had. And then further we looked at the prediction, as it were, or whether we could develop this as a predictive tool for disability in MS in a larger series of patients. And this is the graph from the time. I've removed all the chaff, as it were, just to leave the central motor conduction latency, and this is TI for transcallosal inhibition. So you can see they track each other pretty well. The transcallosal, particularly the duration of this inhibition, appears to be a very sensitive marker for additional lesions. In diagnostic criteria of MS, you're always looking for at least 2 lesions to support the diagnosis. Now, there's a sad sort of on-story to that. Bernd Ulrich and his entire family were killed in 2001 when their plane crashed in Zurich. And but even before that, I'd decided to actually change horses in terms of the tool I'm planning to use. So when I thought initially this may be up here, as in significance, it became very clear that it's rather down there, because the diagnostic criteria came out just a year after we had published the paper, and that was quite heavily relying on MRI, and it's quite clear that that is kind of the way to go. So I linked up with the team in London, and you'll see a number of faces actually in the audience, but you see them also up here. This is the National Hospital, and left of it is the Institute of Neurology, with David Miller really as the lead, my line manager, as it were. And it was interesting because we discussed the project a year earlier, at a conference, and then we met again in Italy at a course. And he said, oh yes, do this on primary progressive MS, looking at normal appearing white matter. We have this series, etc. And then I arrived 1st of July 2001, and he said, well, I think that's not so good. Do this rather. Okay, so do a different project. So, and he introduced me to Francesco Scaravilli, who at the time was the head of neuropathology at Queen Square, and this became a very productive and excellent collaboration, something that I didn't think of before I joined, but this was essentially my science PhD that emerged out of that, although I never got a PhD for it, but a number of papers. Shortly after, I also met Dan Altman, who is here in the audience. Thank you for coming. And I also saw Gareth and Paul Tofts and Claudia, all MR physicists with very deep and applied knowledge of MRI, which is obviously fantastic when you want to use it sensibly. There's also a time when Paul Tofts published his book. I mean, he edited that book. So there was lots going on at Queen Square in that unit at the time. So it was very positive, and I was grateful to Serono before it was taken over by Merck for their support in the ENS as well. Here's a picture a bit like today of them all. This was actually just a month before I moved to Queen Mary in September 2009. But Harry, I think, is up there, and where's Gareth? Somewhere as well. So it was a very good team. It was also fun. This is the office with Massimiliano and a few others, my future wife. And so we didn't only have fun. We also did some work. And this was my first paper that actually came out of this time. Probably one of the few original ideas I had was to use a stereotactic frame in order to guide the dissection of postmortem tissue in order to not essentially make too many assumptions when you have a scan on one hand and then a slice of brain on the other hand, and just assume that what you see on either is kind of the same. So this really guides exactly the dissection to where you've seen the change on the scan. There's now better methods, so just as a word, really 3D printing, so you can get 3D printed individual holders for these, and that's even better. But at the time, this was pretty good. We were supported by the MS Society's Tissue Bank, which is based at Imperial College, and I often had to travel on the tube with a slab of brain like this. I never really disclosed that, but there you are. And so that was a very fruitful collaboration. The reason why we were so interested in this is that you look at the scans here and you think, oh, everything's obvious, okay, there's damage here and there. But in fact, the correlation between the changes, and you've gleaned that a little bit already from what I showed you from that serial MR, and the actual disability or the problems that people develop is not very strong at all. So we call this the clinical radiological paradox, right? That you see a lot of lesions with relatively minor disability, and then only a few lesions, but a lot of problems. So that's why we applied not sort of these sort of snapshot picture MRI, but quantitative methods, and there's a number of them, including diffusion imaging and magnetization transfer imaging and relaxation time measurements, etc. And that is all in order to essentially tease out the specifics that underlie the signal change so that you can actually visualize that or measure it during life when you want to intervene with medication, because we only do post-mortem in order to help the living, of course. So you can see that all these changes, demyelination, even remyelination, so a repair process, can look just the same on the scan. And this is just one paper, but I picked that one out specifically. I'll make that clear in a moment why. where we used magnetization transfer ratio and a quantitative MR index, and demonstrated that there's a very strong association with myelination. So the wrapping around nerve fibers in the CNS is strongly associated with that. And that's not, as I said, not only for its own right and to have a good publication, but in fact this found its way then into clinical application for trials. So here, for example, for a sample size calculation that Dan Altman then undertook based on that data plus in vivo data. So looking at my excitometer, this was a productive period, okay? So these are 6 out of my 9 top publications on Google Scholar, and you can see that that paper is still on top and has just under 800 citations, so it's not too bad at all. So I put my meaningfulness at that point relatively high. You can see here with also diffusion, we looked at postmortem changes, etc. So quite a few things. It demonstrates also what one paper can make a huge difference. Okay, I mean most of you know that, but some of you might not. Had I not had this one published, I think it would have been very difficult to get the Wellcome Fellowship that I then ultimately got, and so that obviously changed my career, as it were, for the better, I think, at least. That's what I thought at the time. Anyway, then I moved on to from Queen Square and over to the Royal London plus the Blizzard. And I think the jury was out for some time whether that is going to be a step up or perhaps rather the opposite, okay, to be perfectly honest. So I think nobody really knew that quite, because certainly what I did meet was lovely people and various sort of constellations. You can see this is Barts MS, group out of them. Some of them left, but many still around, a bit younger back then. And here's actually a very recent photo from Regent's Park. We went out for an away day, and you can see the various professions collected here together, and it's very good to have scientists plus clinicians, I think, together in that. And it started raining right after this photo, so they were all still quite happy. But what happened next was obviously this. This is my citations. Okay, we're climbing up quite nicely, but then what happened there? All flat lines. Okay, and it is obviously not too easy to make that transition and have it kind of have things flying, right? And that's why it's all about the money, okay, or none of it. And I found these folders, right, in my so performance review, right? This is kind of a nice code, isn't it? I had regular meetings with Tim, right? So get the money, and get more money, more grant money. So there you go. And I listened then eventually. But first of all, I think it's clear that once you start something, and I'm grateful Jo is here. I started in her realm on the second floor in pathology. When I say it actually was a group, right? So this is, again, Francesco joined us as an honorary, and then Danielle Carasiti as a postdoc, and Natalia, a PhD student who is also in the audience. That's wonderful. But just look at the year here, okay? This was 2018, 2020, 2018, and even last year, 2021. Okay, so it just takes time to build these things up, and you can just be mindful of that. And I'm very grateful that Tim had the patience, but also that Barts Charity gave us the grant to do all that work. In the background, of course, we already had other sort of plans and ideas or further plans. And that is really the journey of Chariot MS, or a compound that we use in this trial called cladribine. And it starts really here for us. I know there's obviously been in a prior story to that, but for me, really, it started there, where the drug was rejected by the European Medicines Agency, and therefore, or as a result, the owner, Merck, pulled the drug or decided to withdraw it from the global market and essentially leave it in the shelf for good. And but the data was so good that we didn't really buy into that. And so this is a figure that David Baker created, the White Knight, that he was hoping to find. And I think he realized that suddenly he found actually very close to home. And so these are the various steps that we then undertook to essentially resurrect the compound, including two large trial applications. Clear MS was planned as a head-to-head study against alemtuzumab, and then there was a call for a global health program in Mexico, and neither of them was supported. What did change the game to an extent was that we did a meta-analysis of the cancer risk data, because that was what really a key element that led to the rejection, and that was positive in the sense that there was no discernible difference other than the placebo arm in the cladribine trial had 0 cancers. Okay, that made all the difference. And that is now really confirmed over the years. Further analyses, larger patient populations. The drug is meanwhile licensed with over 30,000 on treatment. So that's been essentially refuted. But it just shows you how things can go. Yeah. So it took us then until 2019 really to get our trial funded, and this is again kind of a stretch from 2011, 12 to 2019. And what we're talking about is this, okay? So people who are largely dependent on wheelchairs asking for treatment, and I'm grateful for Christine to be here, who's been following us through this for most really of that, the whole pathway. She's a digital editor, she's done videos for us. It's really been fantastic to work with her, and her sort of commitment and energy is just remarkable. Having the condition herself. Because this is the landscape that we have now, right? So pretty rich, pretty, lots of variety, different mechanisms, although those that are relevant for MS are perhaps quite finite, but still we have a large crop of medications. But when you're in a wheelchair, you're not eligible for them, okay? So you don't, they're commonly excluded from treatment because the trials were not done in people with that stage of disease. And perhaps that's understandable, but that is frustrating, hugely frustrating for people with MS. And that's why it became really a top priority for the MS Society to address this. And we were completely on board with that. Our study was just right up essentially that alley. And why? The question is obviously, is this just about equity, social equity? That doesn't make sense then. There must be a biological underpinning for it. And we obviously know that MS in the early stages certainly is dependent on T and B cell involvement. We think largely that the modulation of B cell subsets plays a very important role. And that happens not only in the early stage of disease, but as this huge study done in Amsterdam has shown, also in later stage of disease. Look at that. They looked at over 7,500 lesions, and per patient, nearly 80% had chronic active lesions. So that means when somebody comes through the door, then in 4 out of 5 situations, you will have somebody with activity, even if you can't see it on MRI or you don't have relapse clinically. Another element is that MS lesions, if you think of it as a random distribution of lesions that they can hit longer tracts in more places than short ones, and that means they are more vulnerable to be damaged. And interestingly, the very inventor of the EDSS, John Kurtzke himself, has drawn this picture down here to illustrate exactly that point. So we are now examining, over and above the role of inflammation itself, this concept too. And there are other elements that suggest that we may be on a useful track here. For example, half of corticospinal tracts, they terminate at the cervical level. And here's obviously a homunculus with a large hand. Why cladribine? We think it's a very useful compound. Well, first of all, we started originally with an off-label preparation that we submitted our grant with, and then fortunately Merck came on board for the second stage, which is obviously of great benefit. People can take tablets rather than coming into hospital to have their injections. And what happens after a single course of the drug is that you get the depletion here of B and T cells with a very long-lasting depletion of B memory cells. This is where we believe most of the activity is, whilst other B cell subsets, which are more relevant for safety, such as vaccination response, immunity against infections, recover relatively quickly. There's also a T cell depletion, but it's not very pronounced. It's only by about 50%. So I think it's more the other populations. We have preliminary evidence, which we've published recently. I'm really pleased to have these 39 authors here, because all of them kind of reflect the buy-in of the community across the UK, really, into this, and even some internationals involved. And so that provides also some, preliminary evidence. This is NIDA, that means no evidence of disease activity, which is coming out as just as you expect from the larger clinical trials. But these are the interesting data, so-called NEPAD, no evidence of progression and disease activity in those who have already quite or more advanced MS. And here we've taken the lower limb function out, so really focusing on those that we need for the trial, and there's also an effect. As I said, it's preliminary. It's clear that there's a biomarker effect that is very strong. This is neurofilament in the spinal fluid, which drops down to normal levels in virtually all of them, except in this one that was kind of excessively high, didn't drop quite down. That's a logarithmic scale. So this is our study, which is now underway. And because we don't want to use the EDSS with all the criticism around that, we're using a hand function test, which is long established, a man-hole peg test, quite straightforward to do. And we have a number of secondary outcomes, MRI, of course, health economics. We're looking also at quality of life, not only in the individual, but also the carer, plus some exploratory work on neurofilament and B-cell subsets. So here's our first patient. He's kind of the, I didn't mention, but there's no upper age limit as well, right, which was very important for people with the disease as well. And Carol is actually 70. She was 70 when she joined the trial. She's a painter and the kind of the model patient for the study. Here's another gentleman whose hobby is chariot driving. Okay. So and here he is with our T-shirt, and hopefully able to continue for long. These are the trial sites. 17 out of 20 are now open, and we have requests for more. These are the Lana trial manager and the monitor, Tanjel. They've been very effective, very good. And this is my champions list, and all of them are on it. Thank you very much. Nothing happens without the local involvement of the PIs. If they can't make the time, can't get the teams doing it, nothing happens. Okay, you have great ideas, and it doesn't happen. Everybody wants to wear the T-shirt now, which is really good start. Okay, so you can see in various disguises. My son often uses it as a nightie, so the XL version. Lots of people are supportive. David and I share an office for quite some time, and the interaction with him has been extremely sort of fruitful and fantastic over the years. Here's our a PPI group, so Patrick, and here's Christine with David. I think this gentleman, here's chaps from Merck. Me too. Oh, this is Jeremy Chataway, who's also been instrumental, really helpful in Charité, giving me a really strong advice here. And I'd really flag up Sue Pavitt, who's here in the audience, from Leeds, who told me so much about, well, first of all, patient and public involvement, how you do it, what you actually have to look after, and etc. But also, I think really the patience that and the reframing that you need to do often in these difficult rounds of, you know, toing and froing, question, answer, etc. with the grand panel. So thank you so much, Sue, for doing all that. Sue has also been leading, jointly leading really with Anna Manzano from Leeds, and this project that I was glad to be involved in, really looking at ultimately producing a decision aid for people with MS about treatments. This is John Myers, another PPI member of our group. He's an excellent cartoonist, so do visit his website. This is how he felt his diagnosis came across, and apparently this is me, but I'm not sure. So. Yeah, he wouldn't probably claim that, just any random doctor. This was my mentor lunch recently with Gavin. Gavin has been obviously wonderful, welcoming, full of energy, and very much driving the whole sort of upper limb function campaign. David here, this is David Miller, who can't be here tonight, Dan Altman and Ben Turner. These two couldn't make it, so thank you very much. Lots more people, students, visitors from China and other places, collaborators, Amos Kochin from Coney, etc. Here's Alistair Compston with Caesar, who wanted a photo, so there you go. Nikos, that's all beautiful. Now, this is from a away day last year, but I think the question is still there. Of course, where now? Where next? And so what next is very briefly attack, assist, access, clinical research across QM and Barts Health and research imaging. Don't worry, it's not too many slides. I trust your regular Daily Mail readers. So there you go, you can read it in the mail. This article is actually really good by Jo McFarlane. I edited it. And so she's really giving a very good account of the attack concept, where we're using another drug, natalizumab, in a very acute setting. What we want is essentially flatlining the disease from the very beginning. I was talking about really late intervention. This is about super early intervention, a stroke-like concept. And we hope we can achieve that. And therefore, one of the primary objectives, co-primary, is whether we can actually enroll within that time frame, and that'll be the challenge. Yes, so we're waiting essentially any day. Next week, I hope we'll have the green light for that. The other project is Assist MS. We're still crossing fingers that will be signed off by the new Secretary of State for Health. The previous two didn't, so we'll have to wait for that, although it's all gone through the other processes. So. Thank you to Rachel Horn, who's I think in the audience, for all her work on that. She's a champion in her own right, really. Has a pretty significant Twitter following now, and that gives her the opportunity to do, surveys, etc., and provide really good insights. This is also from our related PPI work. Finally, access is a huge problem. We can talk about everything and anything, but if you can't get to it, then you're in a really difficult situation. This is 7 out of 10 countries. People face barriers in accessing treatment, so that's the problem. So, final graph on this. So these 3 projects with crossed fingers on the last one. Papers going up. So I give myself kind of a 3/4 tick there. There's always room to improve. Final message to the family. Final message of love and thanks for support. This is all of them. But we don't meet very often, all of us together. Now, this is the last time I saw my eldest daughter. She's in Colombia at the moment, under a waterfall. I hope she's well otherwise, but she's in good hands. So she's traveling. That's why she couldn't be here tonight. I'm very glad about that. So I give you a breather, and thank you very much for your attention, being here, and celebrating with us. Over to Andre Ways.